Good evening, everyone. I am John OLoughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives, and tonight I'm reading another chapter or so from this book, "How the Nation Was Won: America's Untold Story," Volume 1, 1630 to 1754, by H. Graham Lowry. And chronologically, we are in the era of about 1715, 1716, the time when Queen Anne has died. And the succession to Queen Anne is the Hanover kings, King George I, II, and III. And we learn from our author that these Hanover kings are sadly puppets of the oligarchs, the Marlboroughs, the Godolphins, and the Whig junto, which has been running things behind the scenes as far as they could get away with it under Queen Anne's nose. And now that she's gone, their ability to control events has increased dramatically, since it is their George the First of Hanover, who now is the King of England. And he has been thoroughly vetted and checked out by the oligarch party, so things are not looking too good for the good guys in our story. The good guys being the Republicans, the ones that want to have freedom based upon individual liberties and free elections, a classical republic with uh, power devolving to the general people as opposed to being held by the nobles and the aristocrats. So that's where we were in the book. It's great to have everybody with me, and I'm reading stuff that probably very few people would find as a scintillating topic. But what we are doing here is unfolding the actual real history, the half that was never told in your classes. So with that in mind, and with a tip of the hat to our author Graham Lowry, who's done all this work, we can trace an actual lineage of the Republican movement in the United States way back to England itself, then through the Puritans into New England, getting quashed by the restoration of King Charles II, and the people that followed him were no friend of liberty, nor were the people that followed King Charles II, that being the William and Mary kingdom. The time of Queen Anne is also a time where Republican notions, although they were revived with the help of Robert Hunter and the Earl of Oxford at that time, and the surprising story of Jonathan Swift being a terrific aid to the Republicans in those times, the early 1700s, with his power of the pen, his amazing way to put a story together in a way that causes political upheaval. People had to respond to his charges that were subtly written into pamphlets and little stories published in the newspapers. Well, now we turn to the state of Virginia, where we left off the last time, and we were talking about how Governor Alexander Spotswood was one of our Republican good guys in the story. And because of his ability to get some miners from Germany and a expert leader of the mining community from Switzerland, they built a place called Germana, which still exists. And as Andy found the last time, they have a historical museum there. They have a trail to walk and artifacts and lots of uh, lineage. The people that are the descendants of those early German and Swiss miners have traveled back to Germany to meet with their cousins and distant kin and to forge that relationship. It's very interesting to follow what happened. This also follows the Night of the Golden Horseshoe, which was what Alexander Spotswood created. and called the people that went out there and ventured into the wilderness to create those mines and attempt to establish an actual productive economy in the western part, as it was then, of the state of Virginia. Of course, Virginia extended legally all the way out to the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So the claim that many of the speculators was making was to land that was not at all developed in any way. And that, of course, is a iffy claim because generally in the courts of the time, you had to actually develop the land in some way, such as, say, farming. If you farmed the land, then your title became more secure than if you just had a piece of paper that said that you owned some piece of property out in the Ohio country, which you've never seen. That type of title is not as solid as somebody who's living there and working the land. Well, this is what they called the West then, and it's hardly very far west at all. It's not even much past the Blue Ridge Mountains. But that was the topic, if you remember the last time we read from this book in chapter 7, where Alexander Spotswood had also created an expedition to find a gap through the Blue Ridge Mountains. And indeed, they found one which opened up the West. At least it opened it up in terms of the ability of people to get to the West. It didn't necessarily mean that the government was going to go along with that. But we have here an example of the type of productive economy that is trying to be built by people who believe in the human side of government, that we need to actually take care of the people, find ways to produce wealth, and create infrastructures, streets, roads, and means of sending messages like a post office. That kind of development was Alexander Spotswood's dream. And now, unfortunately, we're going to find that the pendulum is swinging against that notion as William Byrd, the oligarch, the old aristocratic Virginian, gets back into power. So, with that little reminder or introduction, and if you'll excuse me a second, I'll be ready to start reading chapter 8 on page 271 of How the Nation Was Won. Thank you, Andy. The power struggle over the West. It was not long before Spotswood's enemies attempted to strike back against his plans for the West. Whatever detailed arrangements they may have known, they had no doubt of his intentions. They also knew that Spotswood's Virginia Indian Company was his key agency for controlling and financing any westward moves, since these depended on positive relations with the tribes of the interior. It had been the passage of the Indian Act in late 1714, following news of Queen Anne's death, that drove William Byrd to London to seek Spotswood's removal as governor. Once word of the expedition of the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe reached London, Byrd's 2 years of wheedling, bribery, and debauchery seemed to open new doors. Early in 1717, Byrd was able to present a petition signed by himself and 13 of his merchant and landowner allies in Virginia to King George's Board of Trade. The petition demanded that the Crown revoke Spotswood's Indian Act, as well as his legislation regulating the corrupt tobacco trade. The king was only too happy to comply, and Spotswood had to inform the council on November the 12th that His Majesty had ordered both laws repealed and made void. Byrd gloated in a letter to Philip Ludwell that his own machinations had defeated Spotswood's policies. he began lobbying with greater frenzy to be appointed to replace Spotswood as governor when he was not too busy chasing prostitutes. Spotswood had already stretched his royal authority to the utmost, having dissolved the assembly elected in 1715 after a session of only 1 month. As he had expected, his enemies enjoyed far greater leverage following the death of Queen Anne. Byrd and Ludwell had reversed the majority he had built in the council and now controlled 8 of the 12 seats. His ally, Peter Beverly, Speaker of the House, fell victim to a massive campaign run by Byrd's corrupt machine, which defeated him for the seat in the House and installed its own Speaker. Spotswood had convened this new assembly on August 3rd, 1715, only to deal with measures to respond to an all-out Indian assault on South Carolina. He was especially concerned with upgrading the Virginia militia in the face of such imminent danger, something which his enemies had blocked throughout his governorship. The assembly not only refused to respond to the governor's emergency request, but turned itself into a parliamentary sham, hearing only contrived grievances down to the most trivial level. They might have continued until the colony was in flames, but Spotswood would have none of it. On September 7th, declaring the assembly dissolved, Spotswood addressed the House of Burgesses. It has been practiced by former assemblies at the close of a session to give a summary of their proceedings, but as I question whether you have truly considered what you have been doing, I judge the task would be too difficult for you to undertake, or too ungrateful for your speaker to deliver. I shall therefore spare you the confusion of telling your own actions, and shall sum them up for you with such faithfulness as may be proved from your journals, with such resentment as becomes a governor who has at his heart the safety and honor of the province, and with such boldness as he may venture who no ways apprehends a charge of one unjust, illegal, or corrupt act during his whole administration. Spotswood reminded them that he had convened the assembly to provide for the security of the country in a most perilous juncture, and that you might, upon that point, consult the people you represent. Byrd's henchmen brought no such matters before the attention of the people. This assembly, Spotswood charged, instead adopted the giddy resolves of the illiterate, vulgar in their drunken conventions, many of them circulated in the handwriting of your members at election fields, horse races, and other drunken meetings. By such means, popular demands had appeared for the repeal of the same measures opposed by William Byrd, especially Spotswood's reforms of quit-rent collections and the Indian trade. Regarding the latter policy, as Spotswood summarized it for them, the Burgesses had demanded that, quote, the act for regulating trade and propagating the Christian faith among the Indians shall be abrogated, the school for teaching their children be demolished, and the gentlemen of whose charge it was erected be banished out of America and their estates confiscated. The entire legislative program put forth by the seditious and ignorant vulgar, Spotswood declared, was to reverse such laws as the last assembly raised up to the basis of religion, justice, and honor. Though Byrd's machine had presented this package as representing the will of 23 counties, Spotswood retorted that it's evident all the subscribers will not make up half a county, nor shall a seditious paper signed by 5 obscure fellows, who must have a scribe to write all their names, ever pass with me for a county grievance. He cited a long list of the Assembly's acts of immorality in legislative affairs. Spotswood declared, I cannot but attribute these miscarriages to the people's mistaken choice of a set of representatives whom heaven has not generally endowed with the ordinary qualifications requisite to legislators, and to keep such an assembly on foot would be discrediting a country that has many able and worthy gentlemen in it, and therefore I now dissolve you. Spotswood did not call the House of Burgesses into session again until April 1718. In the meantime, he took his own case to the people by word and deed, especially around his 1716 expedition beyond the Blue Ridge. He maintained the colony's affairs through the council and prepared for the opportunity to outflank the Birds and Ludwells. Spotswood's transgressing the line of the mountains was a criminal offense in the eyes of the British oligarchy and its Virginia branch. Byrd's cronies soon issued wild slanders against the governor to pave the way for his dismissal. A ridiculous set of charges was anonymously sent to London with a list of 15 queries for investigating Spotswood's conduct. In today's American media, they would undoubtedly appear as front page stories under such headlines as Spotswood charged with extortion, implicated in murder. His enemies actually made such allegations, but Virginians at the time could not be persuaded that reality had ceased to exist. Spotswood's outrage over the obscene complaint may not have been shared by the court of George I, then busily engaged in building up its loot from the Royal African Company's slave trade. Though the charges by Spotswood's anonymous accusers were ridiculous, the political fight was deadly serious. The 11th query charged the governor with high crimes and misdemeanors against the king and the laws of Virginia for his proposals to reform the militia system. If Virginia was to lead the way in opening the West, it would require an effective colonial militia. Not coincidentally, Spotswood was accused of the same crime that the slave trading interests attributed to George Washington during the American Revolution, that is, creating a standing army to impose his own dictatorship. In his response to the Lords of Trade, Spotswood reminded them that even though your lordships might condemn the measures I proposed, not even in Britain were the burdens of defending the estates of the rich so unequally imposed upon the poor as in Virginia. The existing regulations were so full of loopholes that incentives existed for an officer not to muster his men at all. Even if he did, quote, it is no matter of purpose, there being not one officer in the militia of this government that has served in any station in the army, nor knows how to exercise his men when he calls them together. This is the state of the militia under the present law, and therefore I could not imagine that my endeavoring a reformation thereof would be imputed to me as a crime. Spotswood had proposed measures to produce a fully trained fighting force while reducing the economic burdens on the average citizen and increasing the circulation of money and credit available to productive labor. The ironmaker was determined to end the dictatorship of Virginia's one crop tobacco export economy. Instead of a paper militia of 11,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, mustering 5 times a year and ineffectively at best, Spotswood proposed an active militia of 3,000 foot and 1,500 horse, mustering 10 times a year. His enemies charged that this would be more a standing army for Spotswood to govern arbitrarily, and that doubling the number of musters would be a greater burden on the colony. Spotswood retorted that mustering 4,500 men 10 times a year consumed far fewer days of labor than turning out 15,000 men 5 days a year. Under the new regulations, a man could still hire someone to serve in his place, but the querist complained that this sum expended for replacements might exceed the equivalent of 600,000 pounds of tobacco. Spotswood answered, far from granting that such a charge must be to the entire ruin of the country, I apprehend that it would rather be a benefit to the public by the circulation of money and credit that would be increased thereby. In the eyes of William Byrd and his kind, Spotswood's plan amounted to forcing them to underwrite the nurturing of a Republican militia. Worst of all, Spotswood would personally see to their training, reproducing his own military expertise through designated adjustment or adjutants from all parts of Virginia. His enemies charged, Spotswood reported, that the adjutants were intended to huff and bully the people. This, I am sure, was never intended as any part of their office in my scheme, nor am I apt to believe the House of Burgesses to whom it was referred would readily have given them such an authority. While continuing to fend off the attacks of his opponents, Governor Spotswood concentrated his efforts on securing a treaty with the Iroquois nations that would ensure Virginia's rights of settlement in the strategic Shenandoah Valley. That could be effected if the Iroquois would yield their claim to any lands south of the Potomac River, which continues west from its junction with the northern end of the Shenandoah on the western side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The tempo of activity on the Iroquois question increased markedly in 1717. The House of Burgesses remained dissolved, but even the council began to budge when a party of Mohawks attacked Fort Christiana in that spring. Spotswood wrote to Governor Hunter in New York proposing they negotiate, quote, suitable reparations and better defined provisions for peace. Hunter met with the Five Nations at Albany in the middle of June and secured a confession and an apology, but nothing else of substance. In August, the Virginia Council endorsed a proposal by Spotswood, quote, for making a settlement and erecting a fort at the late discovered passage over the Great Mountains, and appealed to King George to give such directions. The wording of their address undercut Spotswood on a key point, however, by proposing that the Five Nations and their allies be restrained from passing the Potomac River on this side of the Great Mountains. Such an arrangement would have left Virginia shut off from the Shenandoah, but in any case, King George ignored the entire proposal. Yet the Indian threat was growing. Governor Keith of Pennsylvania soon reported that a large body of northern Indians was marching towards Virginia. Pardon me. The Pennsylvania case. In September 1717, Spotswood set out for New York to pursue the Indian question directly with Governor Hunter. He stopped on the way at Philadelphia, however, to meet with the new governor, William Keith. Keith was another fellow Scot, originally appointed to colonial service by Queen Anne in 1714 as Surveyor General of Customs for the southern colonies. His official relationship with Spotswood dated from that time. Keith was removed from that office in 1716 during the Whig junto's vengeful purge of the dead Queen's appointees. He was accused, like Jonathan Swift and so many of Swift's friends from Robert Harley's ministry, of being a Jacobite sympathizer. Yet Keith returned to London and in less than a year became Pennsylvania's governor. The full details of this remarkable development remain unknown today, but the circumstances surrounding it provide some very important leads. First, it is necessary to recall some historical background. From the early American vantage point, Pennsylvania is appropriately known as the Keystone State. Geographically, its western extent is the keystone for an arch bridging Massachusetts and Virginia, the colonies which provided the primary foundations for the American Revolution. Following Charles II's revoking the Massachusetts Charter in 1684, the newly founded Pennsylvania colony acquired greater political and strategic significance to America's hopes of becoming a continental republic. Its potential for such a role lay in the fact that it had been chartered in 1681 as a proprietorship rather than as a royal colony. Its governors would be appointed by the proprietor rather than by the crown, and the colony might thus enjoy some degree of protection from the looting policies typically pursued by the English kings of the 17th and 18th centuries. Any such margin of freedom depended, of course, upon having a proprietor who wished to promote it. In the case of Pennsylvania, Charles II imagined no threat when he granted William Penn the proprietorship for his Quaker holy experiment in America. At the time, Charles II was bent on revoking all the charter freedoms which remained in the English colonies. While he had no use for Quakers inside his kingdom, he had applauded their American debut in the 1660s when they served as an anarchist battering ram against the Republican Institutes of Massachusetts. Granting them a colony of their own seemed like a stroke of shrewd management. But just as the demanding realities of organizing a society in the wilderness outstripped the Quaker creed, Pennsylvania's strategic significance also attracted numerous Republican efforts to transform its purpose. In 1688, New England's Republican leader, Increase Mather, was in London seeking to negotiate a new charter for Massachusetts. On May 30th, only days after his arrival, Mather obtained an audience with James II. That same evening, he met with William Penn at his house. Mather recruited Penn as his behind-the-scenes ally in the charter fight, and his diary records 6 more meetings with Penn during the next 6 weeks. Mather also supplied Penn with a Boston militia officer to serve as governor of Pennsylvania during the period through the Andros Rebellion in Massachusetts, led by Mather's son Cotton in 1689. To Pennsylvania's hardcore pacifist, Puritan-hating Quakers, Penn's choice for governor was proof enough that other influences were at work in the colony. The key figure behind the Republican influences in Pennsylvania was the movement's international leader, Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, whose circles included the Mathers. William Penn's recruiting agent for German immigration to Pennsylvania was August Hermann Francke, an associate of Leibniz's, who also organized much of the faculty which later founded Göttingen University, the foremost center of learning in 18th century Germany. In 1699, Penn returned to his struggling colony with a new personal secretary, Scots-Irishman James Logan, who became the leading Leibniz scholar of his time in America and the dominant intellectual and political figure in Pennsylvania for much of his life there. Logan's writings included defense of Leibniz against Isaac Newton's absurd claims of inventing the calculus, which Sir Isaac had incompetently plagiarized from Leibniz. The Newton-Leibniz controversy of 1711 to 1713 had been faked by the Whig junto to discredit Leibniz's growing influence in Queen Anne's cabinet, then headed by Robert Harley, who brought Leibniz's ally, Jonathan Swift, into its inner circle. During the same period, William Penn was also a welcome figure at Whitehall and at the court of Queen Anne. During Swift's first recorded discussion with Harley at a small party Harley gave on October 7, 1710, Swift was introduced to, among others, William Penn, the Quaker. We sat 2 hours drinking as good a wine as you do, he wrote to Stella, and 2 hours more, he, Harley, and I alone. In January 1712, Swift referred in another letter to Stella to my friend Penn. Penn's health was declining, and that fall he suffered an incapacitating stroke. In the will he had drawn up that same year, the government of Pennsylvania was left in the care of 2 trustees in the case of his death. One of them was Robert Harley. Penn survived until 1718. Early in 1717, as one of his last acts, he signed the commission appointing William Keith as governor of Pennsylvania. Keith was the sort of bold, self-assured man that Spotswood liked. He had been impressive enough in his customs post to receive a unanimous recommendation from the Pennsylvania Council for the governorship of the colony. Pennsylvania was anxious to replace the wretched Governor Charles Gookin, who had become notorious for his stupidity, jealousy, greed, and recurrent fits of insanity. Prior to Keith's appointment, in fact, the colony had been generally badly governed. Keith was soon being praised by Logan and others for his skill and good genius for government, his humanity and freedom of access, and his professed goodwill to the people of this province. He would later play a significant role in promoting America's development beyond the mountains, in concert with Spotswood, Swift, and Benjamin Franklin. Pennsylvania was a necessary component to the treaty arrangement Spotswood sought with the Iroquois Five Nations. It was through Pennsylvania that they made their incursions into Western Virginia from their strongholds in New York, and many of the Pennsylvania tribes were themselves tributaries of the Iroquois. With Keith in command in Philadelphia and Hunter in New York, a comprehensive settlement at last seemed approachable. Following Spotswood's meeting with Keith in September 1717, the two governors proceeded to New York, accompanied by Logan, who had formed a close friendship with Governor Hunter. There they worked out two preliminary articles of agreement which the Iroquois were to consider: that they would remain west of the mountains and not cross the Potomac. It was upon Spotswood's return from these negotiations in New York that he learned that King George had annulled the Indian Act, raising once more the threat of chaos on the frontier. Fort Christiana, itself was in jeopardy. The fort and its garrison had been maintained by the Virginia Indian Company, now dissolved by the repeal of Spotswood's legislation. He persuaded the council to permit Fort Christiana to continue operations until a new assembly could be convened in 1718 to determine how to maintain it for the future. Beyond the question of the fort, Spotswood was deeply concerned over the threat to the entire protective screen of Virginia's friendly Indians. For Virginia to pull out of Fort Christiana at a time when its Indian allies were being menaced by the powerful tribes of the Iroquois, quote, may be attended with ill consequences, Spotswood told the assembly, and from the strictest friends may make those Indians our most dangerous enemies. Spotswood's own political enemies now recognized a danger of a different sort. The continuous arc of the western frontier, from western upper New York to the Shenandoah Valley, lay within the governments of three men whose political careers traced back to the circles of influence of Jonathan Swift during the reign of Queen Anne. Governor Hunter of New York, who continued to correspond with Swift, was pressing for the establishment of a fort on Lake Ontario. Governor Spotswood was making plans for an expedition to Lake Erie to secure the opening phase of a colonization drive as far as the Mississippi River. Governor Keith of Pennsylvania was now in a position to link the efforts of the other two and turn them into a reality. He would soon lend official support to Spotswood's proposal for a fortified settlement on Lake Erie. The drive to open the West was rapidly gaining momentum. In 1718, there was a full-scale confrontation over the issue, and Alexander Spotswood was at the center of it. Greeting Virginia's new assembly on April 24th, Spotswood presented only one item to the members for their consideration: the need for a new treaty with the Iroquois. His language was mild. He had been ordered by the Lords of Trade, of all people, to show more respect to the House of Burgesses. After he dissolved the session of 1715 with a blunt portrayal of their actions, Spotswood nonetheless reminded them of an earlier session in 1711 when a bill was formed to raise £20,000 for all-out warfare against the Indians of Virginia. He directed their attention to the Iroquois, the five United Nations to the northward, which showed a disposition to break with us and the Indians under the protection of this government. Spotswood informed the Assembly of his mission to New York that previous fall and of the preliminary articles under negotiation with the Iroquois, which shall be laid before you. He would leave it to the Assembly to determine whether any further measures shall be taken to preserve those people's friendship, but added that if any treaty were to be negotiated, the Indians insist upon having it carried out in Albany. He concluded with a diplomatic appeal for funds to be appropriated for the peace conference, since no reasonable man could think it just that the many expensive and fatiguing expeditions I have undertaken purely for the country's service should be defrayed by my own private purse. The warlike dispositions of the Iroquois against the American colonies was not self-determined. From Pennsylvania, James Logan confirmed that same year that the French were using their utmost endeavors to bring over all the Indians into their interest. Their special target was the Iroquois Five Nations, who formerly stood chiefly in their way, but by their Jesuits and other means they daily debauched them from the English. Logan estimated that 700 Iroquois warriors were already under Jesuit control, while only 2,000 remained friendly to the American colonies. As for the tribes to the west of the Iroquois, French Jesuit control was complete, all the way to the Mississippi. Without a treaty of friendship with the Iroquois, Americans' hopes for developing the West might be speedily terminated. Spotswood's determination to settle the Iroquois question forced the hand of his opposition. That spring, the entire council boycotted his party for the king's birthday, given as a matter of protocol. Instead, the councilors caroused in the Hall of Burgesses with their leading agents in the house while dispersing large quantities of liquor and sedition to a mob gathered outside. The Burgesses replied to Spotswood's address by rejecting any appropriation for negotiations with the Iroquois and declaring that the additional expenses he had incurred on behalf of his colony of the colony justified the salary allowed by His Majesty King George. On May 24th, they adopted a resolution that keeping up and guarding Fort Christiana is not any service or security to this country. Both the Council and the House passed a bill intended to cripple Virginia's postal service, Spotswood's vital communications link with the northern colonies. It so flagrantly violated the barest standards of credibility as well as royal instructions dating back to Queen Anne that it never saw the governor's desk. On May 29th, Byrd's gaggle of hirelings in the House turned their assault directly against Spotswood. They voted to repeal the previous Assembly's authorization for completing construction of the governor's residence under Spotswood's direction and the measly £250 appropriated for him to do so. Instead, the Burgesses decided to appropriate funds for an ornate marble tomb over the simple grave of Edward Knott, who had briefly served as an utterly forgettable royal governor before his death in 1706. He had been buried in the graveyard of Bruton Parish Church, since rebuilt according to Spotswood's classical design. The Burgesses now commended Knott for his prudent and easy administration. Lest there be any confusion over the source of these measures, these Burgesses added a resolution designating William Byrd as the colony's official agent in London. Spotswood adjourned the assembly the next day. He knew that its obstruction of his efforts to secure a treaty with the Iroquois originated among Byrd's henchmen on the council. In refusing to appropriate funds for the negotiations, the House of Burgesses had left the matter to the determination of the governor and council. Spotswood summoned the councilors to the following morning and asked for their recommendations. Of 8 members present, 7 had already sided with Byrd. Led by Philip Ludwell, King Carter, and James Blair, the councilors replied that there doth not appear any immediate necessity for entering into any new treaty. Byrd's 7 dwarfs, plus another absent on this day, had signed a letter to the Board of Trade in March attacking Spotswood's new measures. They claimed to have complied as far as possible with his desires in everything, but he had gone entirely into the all new measures that have been proposed to them and pressed upon them. They believed that the consequences would have been very bad. Spotswood had obtained a copy of the letter at this time and demanded an immediate explanation. His accusers had replied that the question being unexpected, that they did not think proper to give an immediate answer, and had stalled ever since. With the House now adjourned, the signers still maintained that it is not proper to meddle with that letter without directions from their lordships of the Board of Trade. Spotswood declared for the record that he took their evasive answers to be a plain confession that they knew their accusation is groundless, and he would have nothing more to say about it. In New York, Governor Hunter was under a similar attack. Though the Duke of Marlborough had been incapacitated by a stroke in 1715, his ally, General Stanhope, the treacherous plotter against Queen Anne, became the head of King George's cabinet in 1716. Hunter's enemies in New York were soon lobbying in London for his removal and perhaps his death. The reference was to Daniel Parke, the former governor of the Leeward Islands, murdered by islanders in 1710. Hunter read it as an assassination threat and reported it as such to the Board of Trade. He also continued to maintain a personal guard of 2 companies of armed soldiers. Like Spotswood, Hunter was continually the target of fraudulent petitions and baseless charges against his governance of New York and New Jersey. Even if such complaints came from criminals and common disturbers of the public peace, as he wrote to the Board of Trade in 1718, they always found a hearing in London. Hunter challenged the board, however, to look back into the affairs of this province and compare the former confusion with the present happy tranquility. Considering the bizarre state of affairs under his predecessor, the transvestite Lord Cornbury, Hunter's point could not be dismissed out of hand by the Lords of Trade. They reported that Hunter's enemies had not submitted proof of their charges, so no proceedings against him could be recommended. Spotswood's confrontation with Byrd's followers on the Virginia Council also dictated a showdown with the Board of Trade in 1718. He wrote to his old commander, the Earl of Orkney, who was still the official governor of Virginia. The councilors could largely ignore popular opposition, for they were appointed by the crown under authority generally vested in the Lords of Trade. Spotswood urged Orkney to go before the board to demand the removal of 4 members of the Virginia Council: William Byrd, Philip Ludwell, James Blair, and John Smith. Blair had been acting lieutenant governor before Spotswood's removal and before Spotswood's arrival, and continued as a powerful enemy as president of the council. Spotswood informed Orkney that the opposition party not only sought to remove Spotswood, but to secure the revocation of Orkney's title to the governorship as well. Orkney took Spotswood's case before the Board of Trade and urged a change in the council. From Virginia, Spotswood continued to press his own case. On August 14th, he wrote to the Board of Trade of his own bold plan, cited earlier, for the establishment of a settlement on Lake Erie. The French, he emphasized, from their ring of outposts stretching from the St. Lawrence River all the way to Louisiana, quote, may, when they please, send out such bodies of Indians on the back of these plantations as may greatly distress His Majesty's subjects here. That threat could be cut off by the settlement he proposed on Lake Erie, which his discoveries beyond the Blue Ridge had proven to be entirely feasible. We are nearer to support than they to attack. As this country is the nearest of any other to supply such a settlement, and as I flatter myself I have attained a more exact knowledge than any other Englishman yet has of the situation of the lakes, and the way through which they are most accessible over land, I shall be ready to undertake the executing of this project if His Majesty thinks it fit to approve of it. The cost for such an expedition, Spotswood added pointedly, could be entirely met from Virginia's revenue surplus from quit rents, thanks to his having ended the swindle under the former collectors William Byrd and Philip Ludwell. Spotswood's reports of France's growing designs on the West at last provoked some genuine alarm in London. The Board of Trade wrote to Governor Keith in Pennsylvania requesting his own estimate on the extent of the French threat and any measures he might recommend to deal with it. Keith asked for a preliminary report from James Logan. Logan not only had 20 years' experience in the colony, but he had built up an extensive fur trade as well, with a number of French traders on his payroll. The fur trade was a generally nasty business, as Spotswood had learned in Virginia. In New York, Hunter had found that the Albany traders were more interested in supplying the French and their Indians than in the safety of the colony. But Logan insisted that the only way to hold the Iroquois was to expand the British fur trade and undercut the French. He also suggested, however, that the Lords of Trade approve Spotswood's proposal to extend Virginia's settlements beyond the mountains and place forts upon Lake Erie. Keith incorporated nearly all of Logan's report in his own reply to the Board of Trade. Spotswood's hand was strengthened, but the tribes of the Iroquois were once again menacing Virginia. In September, he wrote again to the board, pressing for reviving the policies of his vetoed Indian Act and for a showdown with Byrd's opposing faction. Spotswood warned that a new treaty with the Iroquois was most urgent, but that his enemies on the council were determined to prevent it. Having presented his case to London, Spotswood resolved to wait for the outcome there. He still had no word of Orkney's appeal to the board for the removal of Byrd and his leading henchmen from the council. Both the Byzantine pace of court politics and the slow process of transatlantic communications dictated months of delay. On November 11th, he convened the House of Burgesses. He presented no opening address, but merely sent a message through the clerk that he had nothing to lay before them and that they should proceed with whatever routine matters of business that had been certified by the counties for their consideration. The Burgesses generally expected a short and uneventful session, but even more so as Byrd's committee chairmen and floor managers began tabling even minor items. But by November 20th, nearly a third of the members were at home in their districts. Most of them were supporters of Spotswood and knew that he planned nothing of significance for the session. That same day, under the guise of winding down to adjournment, Byrd's lackeys in the House made their move, controlling slightly more than a third of the total House, but with approximately a three-fifths majority of the members still in attendance. They passed an address to King George, charging Spotswood with the subversion of the constitution of our government, the depriving us of our ancient rights and privileges, and many hardships which he daily exercises upon your majesty's good subjects of this colony. And therefore we humbly hope your majesty will be graciously pleased to receive some particulars from the Honorable William Byrd, Esquire, whom we have desired to appear in behalf of your oppressed subjects of this colony. A list of 14 instructions to Byrd, agent for the colony of Virginia, was then presented for adoption, headed by the direction that he present the charges against Spotswood to the king, and to the utmost of your power endeavor his removal as governor. Well, we're getting up towards 9 o'clock, so I think we'll leave that cliffhanger there as the enemies of free republics, the oligarch party, the William Byrds, are attempting to get King George to remove Alexander Spotswood from the governorship. Well, I hope you found that interesting. I did. A person like me who went to William and Mary and has spent a good bit of his life over in Virginia. It's fun to go through this old history and to think about those Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois were a major important factor, not only in Virginia, but also over here in Maryland, where they would come down and raid, and the local Indians, the Piscataway, would generally um, basically just almost submit to them because the Iroquois are these big warlike people, and the Piscataway are more of a farmer, hunter gatherer types, and not make love, not war. So every season, the hunting season that would um, drive the Iroquois down this way looking for game, the Piscataway would kind of just get out of the way and let them come and do their hunting, take the deer, and go home. It was interesting to read about how civilizations could get along, sharing territory over different seasons of the year. Well, with that, I wish you all a good night. I'll see you tomorrow night for a Macduff's Minefields on Saturday night. And thanks again, Andy Dabala, for the great work here with the sound, the video, the engineering, and all of the great production. Okay, everybody, we'll see you tomorrow.